Good morning. We are on the top of page 384 in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, Mika Hashem Elokeinu, which is the basis, foundational text of Ayin Beis, the end of Ayin Beis, that we've been learning and concluded. But to review again, the reason we're learning the Mittler Rebbe is because, besides the fact that it also gives us context of understanding how the Rebbe Rashab developed it further, but also because the Rebbe Rashab never ended up finishing full Ayin Beis. So by learning the Mittler Rebbe, we can see where the Rebbe Rashab stops and where the Mittler Rebbe continues. So we can assume pretty accurately that the Rebbe Rashab would have continued with the Mittler as the Mittler Rebbe continued. We don't know exactly what he would say, but we could at least have a certain semblance, a sense of the picture. So we're actually coming now to that conclusion. So we've been learning this for a while now, starting from the Alter Rebbe's Maimer in Torah Eir, where is the basis of the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer and the explanation. Then we went over to the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, and last week, we've been learning the Mittler Rebbe and alternating with the Ayin Beis, so we get a picture exactly as the Rebbe Rashab develops further the Mittler Rebbe's ideas, which in turn is based on the Torah Eir of the Alter Rebbe. So we have working here actually with three stages here: the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, the explanation of the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, the Mittler Rebbe, and then the Rebbe Rashab. So we're up to page 384, which I would say is more or less to the point that the Rebbe Rashab stops there. And after 384 will be what the Rebbe Rashab never continued writing. So I'd like to now go back to Ayin Beis, and we're going to learn how the Rebbe Rashab explains the ideas we learned in Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. And namely, let's first sum up where we're at. Just keep in mind that all of this is based on, I'm going to do a little summary of Ayin Beis in general, that I often do on Sundays, and bring it back to where we are right now. So the central theme of Ayin Beis interface is discussed throughout, of course, from the beginning of Ayin Beis, but specifically at the end of volume 1, he begins to talk about two ways that this interface is accomplished. Malmaila lamata, I should start Malmata lamaila and Malmaila lamata. In other words, you can accomplish it from the bottom up, you can accomplish it from the top down. He used the pasuk that we say in Ashrei from Tehillim, Aremimcha Hashem Elokai HaMelech. Aremimcha Elokai HaMelech, rather, not Hashem. Aremimcha Elokai HaMelech. And now that can be interpreted in two ways. It can be interpreted in Mamat L'mayla, that Elokai Aremimcha, I will exalt, I will elevate, I will elevate Elokai HaMelech, which refers to Elikus, as in the word Elikim, and Melech as it relates to existence. And that's through Tefillah. That's Mamat L'mayla, the Yichud Mamat L'mayla from the bottom up. There's another way you can interpret Elikai, Aremimcha Elikai HaMelech, Aremimcha, that starts from Reimamus, from Kesed, and you draw down into Elikai HaMelech. That's from the top down. So Kesed going into Elikai HaMelech, or Elikai HaMelech going into Kesed. Kesed is usually the operative word for transcendence, for the higher dimension. That's why it's Makif. Has explained at length in volume 1, the difference between Kesed and the other spheres. So the other spheres is more the divine as it manifests in existence, Elikai HaMelech. And Aremimcha in this context would be Kesed beyond existence. And the question is, are you doing it from the bottom up or top down? Top down is Torah, as he explains in volume 2 at length. And that led into a long, long discussion, which actually was a parenthesis, over a 550-page parenthesis that began the first third of Ayin Beis, volume 2, and concludes the middle, page 1349, in volume 3, of all the Mamata L'mayla, that Yichur Mamata L'mayla. And in the process, the Rebbe Rashab also brought the pasuk V'yadaita Yom V'shavesa Levavecha Ki Hashem Elokim B'Shamayim Mimal V'Oretz Mitochas Ein Oid. that too is a mamata l'mayla experience. You shall know today. You shall become aware. And it's v'shavesa levecha, and you shall bring it to your heart. Hashem Elikim, this yichud of Hashem and Elikim b'shamayim emal aretz mitachas, to the point even Einoi that the very tzimtzum and the very kelim themselves also are an expression of the divine Helam Atzmi. So that is all Lamata L'mayla, and primarily through tefillah. This doesn't mean there isn't other elements to it, because even in Torah there's also elements of Mat L'mayla, and even in tefillah there's Mamayla Mata. But in general terms, on page 1350, on 1350 on Ayin Beis, volume 3, the Rebbe Rashab said, okay, till now we've been talking Mamat L'mayla through tefillah. Now let's talk about the yichud Mamayla Mata through Torah. And that began the whole discussion that goes all the way till where we are, the end of Ayin Beis, as we have it, page 1477. And briefly, what did the Rebbe Rashab do? He said that Torah, as opposed to tefillah is coming from our hearts. It's coming through our initiative, our longing. That's what tefillah is, mamat l'mayla. We pray to God. We reach, like sulam mutzav atzos, reshi magia shemaim, the ladder that stands on earth, that's compared to prayer, and we climb that ladder to reach to God, which is what tefillah is all about. As we even learned, the Psukkah de Zimra, then Bechus Yetzer, Bechus Avaselom, Shema. It's a journey from the bottom up. Torah, on the other hand, is a gift from Hashem. Matan Torah, Hashem gave us Torah. He gave us His wisdom, His will. Like He explains in Tanya, that Torah is rooted all the way in the highest levels, and God gave us the blueprint of existence, His basically a CAT scan of God's mind. In Torah, we learn about God. In tefillah, we reach to God. And obviously, tefillah, prayer also has verses from the Torah and so on. But its primary focus is Aveda Shebelev, from your heart. Zuhi tefillah. Torah is Aveda Hamoyach, of us understanding and aligning our minds, and obviously our behavior, with what God wants of us. So it's a snapshot from above, and he actually used those words, as I pointed out, that Torah gives us a picture, not through the kelim looking upward, but it's a picture from above, giving us a picture of what the divine is like from the top down. To explain that, the Rebbe Rashab right away in page 1350 began with the Maimer, Make Hashem Elokeinu. The Maimer we're learning now is what he begins, where he talks about the few questions he asked that we find by Neshama, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, and also by Torah Mitzvahs, Ner Mitzvah V'Torah Er. He also asks the question, we find the idea of Adam in Neshamas and also in Torah. And that's where he begins to discuss the three elements of the wick, the oil, the psila, the shemen, the fuel, the oil, and the fire it creates. He explains it both in the soul, that the wick is the divine soul that comes down into the body and animal soul, into the oil, so to speak. The oil is the wisdom, the intelligence of the animal soul, and the objective is to convert and to turn and harness that oil, instead of focusing on its own interests, which the animal soul does on its own, to focus on and come to a place of Ahavtas Hashem L'kecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha. That also the Yetzer Hara, the Nefesh Habamis, should also be aligned toward loving God. And together, this flame, this oil of the animal soul, guided by the psila, the wick that draws and absorbs that oil, turns it into the fire, a divine love of Ava and Oir. Okay. Then he goes on to explain the same thing is also mitzvahs. Their mitzvah also is the divine coming down, Ratzon Elyon, into the physical world. Every mitzvah is made up of physical objects. That's like the wick. And that too is to turn the oil of the Nefesh Habamis and of the material world, not just of the animal soul, but also the material world, like tzemer, like wool or cloth, the parchment for tefillin and so on, turn that into a mitzvah. And that in turn creates Torah Oir, and Oir that itself is explained two ways. Is the Ur coming in their mitzvah producing an Ur, or is the Ur Torah Ur? And this the Rebbe Rashab never really gets back to. He asked the question what that is on page 1466, sorry, on 1466, but he never answers it. That's why we find that answer in Torah Ur, in the Maimer, and in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. And that's where we can, from there, derive it. But he does bring it and cite it all on page 1350, Aleph Shinun, and in the following pages, Aleph Shinun through Aleph Shinun Beis, 1350 through 1352. Okay. Then to explain that, the Rebbe Rashab said, let's understand it through the Ur Hariyah. He said, the power of vision. And here's where the Rebbe Rashab starts bringing other Maimorim from the Alter Rebbe and from the Mittler Rebbe, and together builds it into a whole eloquent and comprehensive mosaic that discusses at length that in Ur Hariyah, the same idea is that we take the vision of the eye, as it is, the Ur and Akeli has its limitations. It needs a siyua. It needs light to support it. We're able to see because we can't see in the dark. We also have limited amount how far we can see. So that's why we need Torah Ur, and we need Ner Mitzvah, and we need the Malachim, and we need the Einei Ha'eda. These are the eyes of the people, and the Malachim who are compared to Einei Hashem, that guide and direct us. Because the Neshama, as it is above, is like the Koyach Hariyah, as it is in the core soul. There, it doesn't have these limitations, but the soul comes down below. That's why you find at times, that sometimes the souls are considered higher than Torah, and sometimes Torah is considered higher than Neshamas. As he explains, if you're talking about Neshamas, how they are above, they're higher than Torah. But as they come down below, Torah is higher than the Neshamas, and the Torah has to guide the Neshamas, as we see practically. A Neshama on earth, in a dark world, Shcheirani, doesn't have direction unless the Torah gives us light and direction and guidance. But the ultimate goal is that the neshama should be able to, down below, access its core that's even higher than Torah and higher than mitzvahs. So ultimately, the neshama will reach the koyach hariyah, the Ur hariyah, as it is in the etzema neshama, not as the neshama comes down below, which I think was pointed out also is something we learned as the example of the divine within existence was like the neshama below, and divine above existence like the etzema neshama. Okay, and that's a long discussion until he finally comes back on page 1460. 1463. Then he finally says, after this long discussion about the Riyah, he says, Ma'atet tzarech lov mashakos ner Hashem nishmas and ner mitzvah. And he goes back to the topic, and this is where he now leads us to the conclusion and starts discussing, okay, so how does the neshama actually affect the divine soul, the wick, affect the oil to become, when the oil is animal soul. The animal soul is antithetical, as we learned at length in the Mittler Rebbe, diametric opposite of the divine soul. Divine soul is ruach ha'adam l'mayla. The spirit is going upward. Ruach ha'behema yiredes l'mayta is the animal soul, the spirit going down. There are two different directions. So the answer is, as the Mittler Rebbe explained and the Rebbe Rashab elaborated, that's the point of why we daven. Through first the Psukkah de Zimra, the Mittler Rebbe says, which prepares and primes the animal soul by illuminating it with the praises of the divine, or seeing the hallelujah, like he said, that we say in Psukkah de Zimra, leading to Birchas Yetz the Malachim, which is the root of the animal soul. So that warms them up and also softens it to the point Avaselam, and then finally Shema. So the Shema and Baruch Shem, Yichud Elyon, Yichud Tata, as the divine soul contemplates on these levels of Yichud, both Yichud Elyon, Yichud Tata, which you could say is also the two levels of Yichud that I described earlier, from the top down and from the bottom up. Actually, we start from the bottom up and then the top down, even though Shema comes before Baruch Shem, or in the Shema itself, Hashem Elokeinu and Hashem Echad, and that will lead to V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, the love, b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha, that also the animal soul will appreciate it, and as it appreciates it, it too will become the oil that will be directed and harnessed to become the fuel for divine love, the fire that it produces. That the Mittler Rebbe explains it that way. The Rebbe Rashab never gets back to the ner mitzvah, that aspect of how it affects the nefesh habamis, but he explains enough that we can then, combined with the Mittler Rebbe, see where this would go. So where are we right now? We're middle of this discussion of what Shema Yisrael and Baruch Shem teach us. We haven't yet gotten to V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha. That's going to be the impact on the emotions of the animal soul. Now, what's interesting thing here is that this, what we just discussed, sounds very much Malmata L'mayla, because we're talking about tefillah, we're talking about Psukkah de Zimra, Birchas Yetzer Shema, and indeed it is, because it's Ner Hashem Nishma Sadam, what the neshama can do on its own. Then comes Ner Mitzvah V'Teireh, is going to come the next stage, that's already coming from above. Ner Mitzvah is a combination of above and below, because it's a mitzvah from Hashem, but it's still elevating the world from the bottom up. Teireh is going back, but he spoke on page 1350, the Amshachim Al-Maila Lamata Mamish. Teireh gives us a whole different, like he said, Hamashpili Lides, going to come down Al-Maila Lamata, the highest level of. So even though he didn't say it explicitly, you could almost say Tefillah is like Yehuda Tata, and Teireh is like Yehuda Allah, or Teireh is even higher, maybe the third level that combines both Yehudim. I'm not sure about that. We'll see where that develops, where that goes. But right now, we are close to the end of the contemplation of Shema and Baruch Shem. So what have we learned? We learned 4 key things to remember when you talk about the contemplation. One is that existence is yesh ma'ayin, infinitely distant, nothing in common between the creator and the creation. This is critical for the divine soul to be aware of and to teach the animal soul. We'll soon understand how the animal soul is affected by that. The second thing, and that includes nothing in common, and there's no shinui and ispilus, and no effect, therefore, on the divine. Unlike yesh mi yesh, where there's something in common, and therefore it's not a total yichud, as I explained. It's not a total exclusive singular reality. There's a yesh and there's another yesh. Yesh ma'ayin tells you that the ayin, the yesh, is completely bottled to the ayin. The next point is then the ayin itself, there's 2 levels. The ayin of the yesh hamiti, which is complete bitli, yichudei Allah. It's simply God saying, I want to express myself. I want to manifest in a state of gili, not built in mitzias nimtza of just a yesh hamiti. And then that ayin, there's another level of ayin, the ayin that's kodev el hayesh, that manifests and relates to existence. Between these two, in order for this to fulfill its function, you need to have a parsa. That's the next point, a partition. Partition between these 2 levels of ayin, or the 2 levels of Daas Elyon and Daas Tachton. That partition is the partition in general between Malchus and Atzilus and Malchus and Biyah, or in Bria. On higher levels, it's the partition between Kesed and Chachma, because there too you have Yesh Ma'ayim, Chachma Ma'ayin Temotza. It's the partition between Moichin and Midas, Bina and the Midas, the throat, and the partition of the Kesed to Chachma is the membrane above, between the skull and the brain. And as we spoke, different levels. However, and here comes the main point. This is all in order for Ishtalshalis to exist. For us to be an existing independent consciousness, you need all this. Or else we'd be completely subsumed or consumed and completely nullified in the presence of the divine. So you need these tzimtzumim and these gradations, mitzad Ishtalshalis, as he puts it. But mitzad Lamaila, the way the Eibishter looks at it, Hail Deus Havaya. Eibishter includes both Deus, Daas Elyon and Daas Tachton as one. Because the truth is, even the ayin that manifests and relates to existence, that's, from our point of view, the teacher, so to speak, relating to the student. But from the teacher's point of view, that's just another form of his own expression. Like he said, that ayin is same and equal to the ayin as it is prior to existence and higher than existence, to the ayin hamuchlet, to the total, to the higher level of ayin that's completely nullified. In other words, Yichud Elyon and Yichud Tachton are really one from that perspective. And we're told this. This is also part of our contemplation. It's also part of what we are focusing on. And that's where we more or less came to on the top of 380. We learned the last class, 383, and top of 384, to understand this paradox, and by how God is no paradox. He manifests within existence, yet is not defined by it. He contains all existence. He contains the space of existence. He contains it, but it doesn't contain him. He defines it, creation, but creation does not define him. He says clearly it's two hafchim when you think of it from a logical point of view, but by the Eibush, it's all one. In the process, he gave the example of the neshama beguf, that there it's affected by the body. In the divine energy, it's not affected, but it does manifest within and relates to existence, but it remains removed. Now, we'll soon understand, after we learn this in Ayin Beis, because the next section, in Ayin Beis, I want to go now to page, what page are we going to learn? Here, page 1474. We already learned 1470, the pages before, in parallel with the Mitla Rebbe. And here we're going to learn how the Rebbe Rashab explains the joining of Daas and Daas Tachton, how by Hashem they come together as one. Then the Rebbe Rashab finishes Ayin Beis with that, and then we go back to Mitla Rebbe and we see where this theme continues to develop now, and how it comes back to teach the animal soul something that would cause it to be affected to love God instead of loving itself and its own self-interest. But the Rebbe Rashab never goes back to Nefesh Habamis, at least not in Hemshech Ayin Beis in writing. But before we get there, I just wanted to put it into context. So we're going to learn now that Rebbe Rashab elaborates on the themes that we just learned on basically, let's see here, pages bottom of page 381 through the top of 384 is now the Rebbe Rashab. Sometimes he uses the exact language, Mitla Rebbe, but in most cases here, there's a lot more elaboration, a lot more the Rebbe Rashab's original language. I also want to point out something, maybe it's worthwhile doing right now, or maybe afterwards, but I'll point it now. It's fascinating to see something even more. Go back to the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, and you can start seeing how the Alter Rebbe said it all in a very concentrated few lines, and how the Mitla Rebbe and then the Rebbe Rashab developed it into a whole sugya. I find it amazing. So I just want to open the Torah Air and just read a few lines, and you'll see, I would never have been able to read into that, all this that we learned. But you see what the Rabbeim were able to do. Now, besides the fact that they were brilliant themselves, very likely they also received this. The Mitla Rebbe was, after all, was there when the Alter Rebbe said that Maimer. And it's hard to imagine that he didn't chazir it before him, and they probably discussed it. So they had obviously that point of reference. And the Rebbe Rashab, of course, was Makabel from his father, who was Makabel from his father all the way back. Rebbe Marash, the Tzemach Tzedek, the Mitla Rebbe, and the Alter Rebbe. So it's not a surprise. But the point is, when we look at it now, you literally can see how one short piece in Torah Eir becomes this whole, literally, 20 pages at least, maybe more. So let me just bring the Torah Eir here. I want to just read a few lines, and you'll see how everything we've learned is really all derived from and drawn out from the Alter Rebbe's mind. But 1 second, please. Okay. So I'm looking at the Torah Eir now, page bottom of page 38b and 38c, top of 38c. So he says like this. He asked the question, how can a divine soul impact? How can you impact the animal soul when the animal soul is driven by its own self-interest? The words he uses here, let's see here.
What's the page number in the book itself, like the English page number?
Well, 38b has no English page number. 38C is page number 76.
Thank you.
So he says like this. So the Cheder ain't moving. Eich Yishuv Hayetzer Hara La'avas Havaya Ayidei Ha'adam V'aloi Lo Yishmaelov. So it's in his own language. He says, how will the soul respond, return to loving God? In other words, through the person's Aveda, he won't listen to him. In the words of Ayin Beis, it was it's a yesh. On 1466, he said, and the Mittler Rebbe has it in his own words. Basically, all the same question. How do you impact something that's so antithetical to godliness? It's called animal soul, and I think we don't need proof. Every one of us has an animal soul. We know quite well where that animal soul, his interest is, and where it could lead us to, unfortunately. So the Alter Rebbe continues, and then goes through explaining that Nefesh Elikis, Nefesh Abamis both have Seichel and Midas, very antithetical to each other. And then he says like this. I'm just going to jump around, but a few key lines. So the Seichel HaMuskal of Gashmis is the Nefesh Abamis, is human intelligence, all about itself. So, and the goal is, he says, here's the goal. Let me just say, and the person has to refrain, likafyalon. He has to refrain and withhold and subdue and control the animal soul, that it shouldn't follow its own impulsive emotions, following its own seichel gashmi, its own mind, its own physical interests. It should come to a state of loving God with all your heart, which means that means that over the powering the power of the divine soul that overpowers this animal soul. And you contemplate on Erein Sof, b'posuk rishon de krishma Shema Yisrael. You contemplate on the first verse in Shema Yisrael. Shema Loshen Avona means Shema from the word understanding, like we learned the Mittler Rebbe. Ki Havayu Elokeinu, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu. What does that mean? Pirush Elokeinu, hu inyan isavas b'chinas mamala klalman v'sevav klalman, hu nimsha b'chinas Havaya hoya hoya v'yiyah, shu erin so baruch hu. That the isavas that comes from malaklam and sevav klalman, here it's mashma that Elokeinu includes both. That comes from Havaya hu Elokeinu. That comes hoya hoya v'yiyah. Havaya from the word hoya v'yiyah, where past, present, and future are all one, meaning he's above time and above structure. That's Erein Sof Baruch Hu, Shu B'chinas Ayin. That's the level of Ayin. V'yisavus hayesh hu ma'ayin mamish. So you're contemplating Havayu Elokeinu, that with divine, that manifests within existence, is one with Havaya that's beyond existence. And this creation, V'yisavus hayesh hu ma'ayin mamish. Then he goes on that it's nimshach tamid yesh ma'ayin. He constantly, interestingly, the Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab, I don't think, maybe the Rebbe Rashab, yes, the Mittler Rebbe, I don't know, focus that much on this point of perpetual creation, but the Alter Rebbe does say it, but then he goes on to the points that we all learn now. Listen to this. V'hu avaya echad. Atahu kaidem shenivra v'atahu. That's one Havaya. That's when then you say Havaya Elokeinu is Havaya Echad. So even though Havaya and Elokeinu you could say at two levels, says no, it's all one, because the same Eibush Kedem Shenivreilam as he's beyond existence is one with God that is within existence. Now he doesn't spell out those words, but that's essentially the Tachton. When you learn the Maimorim that we just learned, Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab, very clear what he's saying. And they all based on this, they built what they built out. She'ein Yisavas Elam is Pelim Shum Shinui Chaz V'Shalom. Pel Boy, because the Yisavas Elam doesn't affect God in any way, no Shinui. the word of shinui. All reading Torah now, because you can't compare God's actions to the actions of a person of flesh and blood. When human actions, so the koich hapoel mamish, the power of the person who's the producer, is literally within the nifl, and it affects him. When a person builds something or does something, any act that we do, he has to free himself from something else, and he has to immerse himself in the thing that he's doing. He can't be doing two things at once. That means he's engaged by it. That means it's affecting him. So therefore, the thing that he is doing creates a shinu in his seichel, because his mind is now involved in this, and it's affecting his mind to focus on this, and it impacts him. But the creation of existence of the world, they don't cause any change within the divine. That means the divine is there, but it's not affecting him in any way. In the words of the Mittler Rebbe, he contains it, it doesn't contain him. He defines it, it doesn't define him. And this unity of the divine is exactly as it is before God created. In other words, no change from before creation to after creation. That's that level of the divine that creates, but is removed to that extent that it's all one. And then he says, now he brings Baruch Lefi, and he brings from Shema Yisrael, we now go to Baruch Shem, Lefi Baruch Shem Kved Malchusei, Shekolis Baruch Shem Kved Malchusei La'elam Vod. What does that mean? That the name of God, Meshem Malchusei, the name of his kingship, is La'elam Vod, which we're now talking about Malchus as a manifest within existence. So here, even though he doesn't say it clearly, but you see now the both interpretations. We first said Hashem Elokeinu is a combination of both Mamal Kalam and Seif Kalam, is both one with Havaya. So you see there Yechudi Lo, Yechudi Tato, even though he doesn't use those words. Now he's saying Baruch Shem Kved Malchusei Shekol Yisavas Elam is V'kiyumen V'chayusin Elam B'chinas Malchusei is Baruch. That the entire existence and the sustenance and the energy and the vitality in existence is only from Malchus, Baruch Shem Kved Malchusei, all from Malchus. Shebemashu Melech Aleim Machayu Mahava Esem. By being king over them, basically a reflection of the divine, which is Melech, that's what gives them, sustains and creates them. The Hainu B'chinas Shmoy is Baruch B'lvad. It's only Shmoy. Like we learned the Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe Rasha both explain Shmoy is only a reflection. Shmoy is not him, it's only his name. And yet, they said, Hayahu Shmoy B'lvad. On God's level, he is one with his shape. V'sham Shayach Keich HaPoel B'dvar Hashem. And here you see hinting to this development this which is developed in the Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab's Maimer. That's where you say Keich HaPoel, that even though the divine is removed, that's where the Shmoy is Keich HaPoel B'dvar Hashem Shemayim Nasu. Kidvar Melech Shilten. Ksiv Malchus Malchus Kol Elam. So here's how the divine manifests in like Keich HaPoel B'nifel in words. Yehi Oyer Tasara Mamoris discussed in the Maimorim of the Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab. Yochid Chei Elamim Melech Kaneda. And all this is Yochid Chei Elamim Melech. So even as Melech is Yochid Chei Elamim. So now comes the conclusion. That's the contemplation. So these, I guess, 3, 6, maybe 15 lines, 1-5, becomes this basis of everything we've learned in the Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab's Maimer. And now comes the conclusion, which the Rebbe Rashab never gets to, the Mittler Rebbe will get to, and we'll learn that. It says, when a person immerses himself, his mind, his thought, with the depth of his understanding and the innermost of his heart, that's when the animal souls, or the living soul of the animal soul, comes nullified. Maskalosa begashmis, from its focus, its physical intelligence, which is its natural intelligence. It gets nullified by the overpowering contemplation of the divine soul in this greatness of Ein Sof Baruch Hu that we just discussed. And that contemplation of the divine soul, in turn, gives birth from the Bina and his contemplation a powerful, tremendous, fiery love, like a fiery flame. The dafka b'His Baruch, to attach to God, b'dveika v'chsheika v'chafetza b'islavas atzuma ad kles hanefesh k'meshkasa nichsafa v'am kol sanafshi. All this impacts that the person, and this also is going to impact the animal soul, should desire a passionate desire to be connected to godliness. V'oz tiyeh hachokma shebenefesh achiyunis kishemen hanimshech acher apsila. And that's when the chachma of the nefesh achiyunis, the wisdom of the animal soul, becomes like oil that follows, that is drawn, following the wick of Neir Hashem. Shehi Neir Hashem nishmasadam shanasham hi apsila. The neshama is the wick. Hamechaberes era ava aza, that attaches, it connects this passionate love, the Ayin Beis, to radiate lahoyer benefesh habamis to the point that it too should yearn and long for godliness. And to the point that it should be a hafta, the love, with both parts of the heart, both sides of the heart, both the right and the left, including the nefesh habamis. And then he goes on how it even adds even more power. And the nefesh habamis adds, because the shemen feeds the psila, it adds even more, which we'll also talk about and get back to later. But I don't want to go too far off. So what I wanted to do here is just show the grounding, to ground what we've learned in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer and the Rebbe Rashab and Ayin Beis in the original Alter Rebbe's piece. Those, whatever you want to call it, 15, 20 lines, that section I just read. So it's quite fascinating to see that flow. And with that said, I'm happy to take some questions if anybody wants to ask, even though these ideas have been I've discussed it quite at length till now. But as I said, it's always good to refresh and contextualize, because of so many details, sometimes can lose sight of the bigger picture. So what we're up to now is to go back to Ayin Beis and discuss the yichud of both yichudim, how both become one in the divine. The Alter Rebbe never says that. He never says there's yichud ilah, yichud tata, and then both are joined. But now that we learn what we learned and we go back, we can see it's there. Because he says clearly, there's Havaya, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and Atu Mishenivra Elam Atu Les. You see clearly that there's two, and then they become like one. He just never spells out those three steps in those words. But it's clearly there, and it's not like some new chiddush, but you have to be, like I said, the Rabbeim spell it out, and then you can go back and see how it all is involved, is all in there. And you can also see how Chassidus developed from Chachma of the Alter Rebbe into Bina of the Mittler Rebbe, and ultimately in you can call it Hoyd of the Rebbe Rashab, that we are middle of learning now. So we're going to go back now to the Yichud, but in case anybody wants to ask anything, by all means.
I've been meaning to ask you this since we got into this topic. Now that we're kind of pulled out, the focus is pulled out to see everything. So there's a lot of talk about, Ein Shinui. There's no change, no effect in the higher levels of Elokus. Frankly, well, in Malchus it says as it comes down, as the neshama comes into the goof, then there is a change in the neshama.
No, not when it comes. That's in the neshama and goof, not with Elokus, not godliness.
Right. No,
even godliness in the lowest levels is exactly as it is in the highest levels.
Right.
We're not talking avodah now. We're not talking about a person's mitzvah Tachton. We're talking process of creation.
Correct. I was just trying to contextualize the question. there's a lot of focus of Ein Shinui, and while I certainly understand the importance of that from a Yiddish metaphysics, Jewish metaphysics, that there's only one God. There's no separate gods. There's one God, and it's all one God, and it's all one perspective of reality that's his. We see it from one, he sees it from his, but it's all one. I understand why metaphysically the idea of Hashem Echad is so critical. Obviously, that there's no other God, there's nothing but God. So I get that it's a fundamental principle of Judaism and Chassidus, etc. But nevertheless, there's so much focus on Ein Shinui, even though we're trying to answer the question of how do you harness the Nefesh Bahamos, how do you get it to connect with the godliness, they're not necessarily related per se. And so I guess my question has always been, it's a fundamental principle, and there's always a chas v'shalom. Don't think there's separate deities, God forbid, or some separation of God in some way.
So are you asking how does this play out with affecting the animal soul? Is that in one line your question?
Yeah. Why is the focus on Shinui when we're focusing on
so
harnessing the animal soul?
So I would wait till we finish with the Mittler Rebbe where he elaborates on this. We haven't reached there yet. The Rebbe Rashab never gets back to that. The only place we have so far what I read in Torah but the reason we're learning the Mittler Rebbe, because the Mittler Rebbe will speak about it, and I've mentioned a number of times, we haven't gotten to that yet. He's still talking about now the union of Daas Elyon and Daas Tachton. So if that's your question, how it affects the animal soul, I would wait till we read it inside in the Mittler Rebbe. If you're very curious, you can just go ahead and look.
I didn't say so much how it affects. Why is there such a prevailing focus on Ein Shinui?
So I believe I explained this, frankly, I think I explained this, I would say not over 5 minutes. I probably spent quite a few time in explaining that.
I understand what it means, but why the focus?
No, it's the only way to explain utter unity. Since we're talking about yichud and you want to have utter unity and there's no room for anything else, and Shinui is critical in that context because it demonstrates the utter unity and the utter bittul. That's how I explained it. More details, I would just suggest go back to almost any class. I elaborated on it. It's one of those things that I will say again, you need to review it again and again. It's not a quick question-answer thing. It's understanding how ultimately, that's why it's so important to contrast it with Yesh Miyesh. Everyone does, the Alter Rebbe does, they all do that because it's the only way to explain total and utter unity. I don't know if you remember when I spoke about mikveh, when you immerse something in a mikveh, you can't even leave one. So Ein Shinui is critical to that because Leisha Nisi essentially means that there's no, as soon as you say there'd be some shift, some change, then already you have two states, the before and after. So how it affects the animal soul, that we'll learn later. If you want to understand, it's a piece of the whole understanding of utter unity.
Yichudim, the yichud of the two yichudim.
No, not just the yichud of the two. The general that God is one in all states, from beginning to end, from the top to the bottom, even in the lowest levels, as the Mittler Rebbe says. Yeah.
Rabbi, I have a question.
And it's by the way, Shinui does not mean necessarily only that he does not get affected by it as an impacted. Shinui means a shift. Shinui means everything in existence is affected by something. Even the highest level, everything. That's the definition of existence. That this is constantly going through change, and any other phenomenon can change another phenomenon. That's the whole point. That's all of science is based on that. That two bodies, two entities are going to affect each other. And only talk about a creator can be completely removed from that. The utter transcendence, and most importantly, it's transcending transcendence itself, because he's not defined by existence, he's not defined by non-existence. Yeah, go ahead, Rob.
Thank you, Rabbi. So, like, we're told that we get taught the entire Torah when we're in the mother's womb. This is a little roundabout. I'm just trying to see, like, what happened to I understand that Tzimtzum is a big gift, and at the Matan Torah, what happened? Did we get a sort of an imprint on our animal soul of what that yichud, the whole yichud is, and now we come back to try to remember, or is that totally off base?
Well, if you really read in between the lines, or more than between the lines, the animal soul was created by God, not by humans. the question is, the question is to remember we spoke the animal souls rooted in the angels. That's why we speak about the angels before Shema. So the animal soul, however, is not aware of it. It's aware of its own interests. In other words, even the klippus in this world, even the darkness was created by God. The animal soul is not a man-made creation. So that's number one, that the divine created it. The challenge is, how do you get the animal soul to know that? That's why you need this contemplation. That's my short answer for that. But again, the animal soul will be discussed. We'll get to it.
Mhm.
The Alter Rebbe, I just read what he says, but it's very short, how it affects it. It doesn't speak in detail how it affects it. The Mittler Rebbe will speak it. And of course, it would have been beautiful if the Rebbe Rashab had continued, then he would have elaborated.
Mhm. So the animal soul is really rooted in the higher place.
We not only that, we said it was rooted even higher than the divine soul in Tayu.
Because it comes from Toho.
But it doesn't know. It just doesn't know.
Exactly, that's the story of that's the story of life.
Mhm.
Yeah, it doesn't know, and it follows its own thing. And but I wouldn't jump. We're not up to the animal soul now. I just really resist going there because why would, when the Mittler Rebbe is going to explain it, why I speculate,
Thank you.
How necessary is the muscle of the candle? I mean, I find myself listening to the Chassidus, and now I can explain the candle better than having the candle explain the Chassidus. And I maybe because I don't understand anything. That it seems to me like an unnecessary and an unnecessary paradigm.
Well, for understanding it, can the whole thing be understood without using the whole idea of the flame and the candle and meaning the wick and the oil? I guess you could understand it even without that, but there's a few things that it definitely adds. First of all, it adds understanding of it all. Secondly, it also explains the very concept of why soul is called a flame and why mitzvah is called a flame, a candle. And finally, I'm sure if you start digging deeper, you could find it. I mean, I would wait till the end of the whole subject to see, since we haven't finished it yet, especially Mittler Rebbe's Maimer, we have quite a few more pages. I would wait till it's finished, and then we could see. I mean, very clearly they all bring it. And I mean, to me, it definitely helps. When I visualize that shemen is like oil that can be used for your own selfish purposes, or it can be used as fuel, it's a very powerful visual of how your animal soul becomes fuel for the divine. I think it's, had we not had that, it would be harder to imagine in a certain way. But look, it's a question you could ask about every subject matter. Can you understand it without the example? I don't just see it as an example, obviously, but can you understand? Yeah, maybe afterwards you could understand it without it, but why do that when you have that part of it and it's all part of the Torah of it? So I don't see any reason to separate and try to figure out what it adds, what it doesn't add.
Just as a follow-up.
But I think the
Sorry.
more we talk about it, the more we'll see, I guess, its relevance. I will say in the Maimer and Torah, it very plays very dominant role, much more than in the Mittler Rebbe and the Rebbe Rashab. So far, that is, because especially in the beard, he goes into the whole thing with Neir, with Shemen. So it clearly is a very critical piece in the whole understanding of it. And I'm sure when he speaks about how one candle lights another candle ad infinitum, I don't know if you remember that piece. So there's a lot about the candle that has not been discussed recently that adds to the whole equation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Just as a follow-up on this Ayin Shinui, is it the notion, in part, is it the notion that getting the animal soul, and I'm not trying to jump ahead, I'm just trying to say this chelik, this part of the explanation of the rubric to answer the broader question of harnessing the animal soul, is it the idea of trying to understand from perspective that the animal soul is mamish ultimately.
We'll find out when we read it. I don't want to jump. I don't know.
You're just not going there.
We read it inside. We'll see what he says.
But isn't it? It seems like that's the whole point. Like getting the animal
that's
soul
what
to
seems
recognize.
to you, but I'm not ready to say that. Until I read it, I want to hear what the Mittler Rebbe has to say. Not fair?
Well, it is, but you answer and say it's critical to understand the whole idea.
Well, we
of
didn't
the
finish. We're in the middle of a
Yichudi-
mimer. We're literally in the middle of a mimer. It's not finished. If it's finished,
Okay,
and
all
you
right,
said,
I'll let
well,
it go. I'll let it go. Okay, I got it. I'll let it go. It's a burning question, though.
okay, so I'm going to read now inside Ayin Beis, and we're going to go now till the end of Ayin Beis, because that everything we learned in the Mittler Rebbe is the basis of the next 1, 2, 3, 4 pages. So I'm on page 1474 in Ayin Beis. We have already learned this before we began this whole exercise, but now we're learning it with much more context. So he says like this now, the new paragraph on page 1474 in Ayin Beis. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. Omnom mashakosov kel deis havaya. After we explain, if you look right before, he speaks about Shema and Baruch Shem, that you have both Yichudim, the bitl of Yichudi law, bitl of Yichudi Tata, bitl Mitzias and bitl Ayesh. He says now that it says kel deis havaya, that havaya is both deis. Yeah, he encompasses both. Who shebchinis Atzmus ein sof kelu beis deis. That Atzmus ein sof encompasses both perspectives, the Daas Elyon, the Daas Tachton, the higher perspective and the lower perspective. Dagam shein hofchim mizeh mizeh. Little be the words of the Mittler Rebbe, even though they're diametric opposites. The Daas Elyon b'chinas ayin mamish. Daas Elyon is mamish ayin, utterly nullified. It's like the light of the sun within the sun. Shelo yeshum mitzias klal. There's no existence altogether. It's simply the divine wanting to express himself. But Das Tachton, on the other hand, who she is b'chinas mitzias, there is an existence. However, this existence is nullified and aligned, but only bitla yesh, not bitla mitzias. It exists, but its whole existence is aligned with godliness, because there's something that exists. So even though these are two opposites, hine ba'atzmus ein sof beis hadeis aches hein. In Atzmus ein sof, both perspectives are one. Sheshneim emes, they're both true. V'shneim miyuchadim be'ein sof, and both are united in Ein Sof. Ub'chinas bitl v'ayin mamish, and they're both united, and they're in a state of bitl and ayin mamish. Both, even the lower one, is also in a state of bitl and ayin mamish. And now he explains, this is explanation that the Rebbe Rashab is adding that we don't find in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. So you'll see now how it further develops. The Rebbe Rashab, what does he say? Tehinen is bar le'il, because it was explained earlier, the bechinas ha'ayin shalei yesh amitu, bechinas ha'era kol batzmusei. The higher ayin of the yesh amiti, which means the yesh choosing, the koyach esgal is choosing to express himself. He hasn't yet expressed himself, but he wants to. And that state, that's the Eira Kol Batzmusei. That's an Eir that's still encompassed within the core. Shemiyuchad Hu Batzmusei is Baruch. It's united within Atzmusei is Baruch, within the core essence. Valkenu B'chinas Ayin Mamish. That's why it's literally Ayin, total null. Ba'ayin Shalei Yesh HaNivra we learned. The second level of Ayin of the Yesh HaNivra, which means the divine energy as it relates and becomes, it engages with existence. Hu ha'ora. She b'chinas yitziv is galus matzmusei. This is a reflection that is a state of like leaving, going outside of atzmusei. Let's make that clear. It doesn't mean outside literally, because nothing is outside of the divine, but its energy is not reflecting purely the source. It's already engaging with and interested in the other. That means it's galus. You see, as galus matzmusei lahavis haseyesh. It's applying itself to create the yesh. Who, as we learned, who they are Parsa. One second. Yeah, like explained on page 1473 on top. This is through the Parsa because this is a leap from the higher ayin to the lower ayin. So this is through the curtain, the partition, hamafsekes beineim, that separates between them. So like a curtain, it diffuses the light and creates a separation that the Oyer should come somewhat of a distance from the divine, like distance from the source, and a state of removed. Now, again, this is not removed from God's perspective, but from our perspective, it's not a pure reflection of the essence. It's a reflection that associates with existence. And because of that, it's kiruv el hayesh. It's rachik. That's why it's kiruv el hayesh. Once you say yehi oir, yehi rakia, Hashem is saying, let there be light, let there be a firmament. Teitz desha, let there be vegetation. So of course it's coming from the divine source, but he's already defining it according to the specific creation. Whereas the first level of ayin doesn't have any type of detail like that. Doesn't have any. It just says, I can't even say I want existence. Strike that. It's just God saying, I want to express myself. So this is now kiruv el hayesh, and therefore vayichud va'bitl b'zeh hu b'chinas bitl hayesh bilvad. And the yichud, and it's interesting, he says both yichud and bitl because they come together. Because if there's no total bitl, there's no total yichud. So the yichud and bitl and vice versa. So the yichud and the bitl in this is only bitl hayesh, because there is a creation that God wants it to exist. He doesn't want it to become annihilated. He doesn't want it to annihilate it. So he's explaining. Now, when you think of it that way, who does the Parsa affect? The whole hefsek ha-Parsa, the whole separation, interruption of this, of the curtain, of the partition, is only for Gaba Elmas Vishtalshus Bilvad. Again, words from the Mitler Rebbe's Maimer. It's only comparison to the worlds and the Shtalshus. Shalagaba Elmas, from the perspective of the worlds. V'chein legabe Shtalshus B'chlal, in perspective of Shtalshus B'chlal, which is even more than the world. The world is Atzilus Bri Yitzir Asiyah. Shtalshus would be in the whole cosmic order. Hatzimtzum v'Parsa Mailim u'Master. The tzimtzum and the parsa, the diminishment or the concealment and the partition, they conceal and they cover up. And the source of their creation, of existence, of the elements, is in a state of richuk and avdola. There's a distance, so to speak. In order for that energy to be able to associate with existence, there's a richuk and avdola and a separation. Because it's become a yesh. We're not talking about that level of the ayin of the yesh amit. We're talking about the ayin, the yesh anivra. Avlagaba Atzmus Ein Sof. So in other words, everything we learn about these two levels and the parsa between them is only from the point of view of existence. But compared to Atzmus Ein Sof, Tzimtzum Parsa Ein Mailu Master Klal. The tzimtzum, the concealment and the curtain does not conceal or cover at all. And from that perspective, there's no separation, no pause, and no distance at all. It's similar to what it says, the Rebbe explains often when it says Ashmini Atzeres. So the Medrash says that God said after 7 days that we were together, referring to God and the Jewish people. Jewish people compared to the princess of the king. And now God says, I know that now you're going to be going back home, back to your homes, and we will miss each other. So before we go, we separate ways. He says, let's make one more suda, one more meal on Shmini Atzeres. Kikosha alai pridaschem. Because it's difficult for me, your separation. So the question that's asked is, it should say pridasenu. Kikosha alai pridasenu. Our separation is difficult. Why does it say your separation? And the answer is because from God's point of view, we never get separated. But from our point of view, there's a separation. So God says it's difficult for me to see that you feel separate from me. So let's be together to just gather more strength. That you will carry that strength. That when you go back to your respective locations, you'll recognize and feel the achdus with me. But not kosher by pridasenu, it's pridaschem. Very similar idea on that level with the Shmini Atzeres. So that's what he says. So ein shum lehafsek v'richu klal. O kamesha kosav, like it says, ochein ato, kel mistater. Indeed, you, Kael Mistater, the God that Mistater, that conceals. The B'chinas HaHester Koyach Ein Sof. In other words, the Hester is not some other outside force. That itself is the Koyach Ein Sof, K'may Koyach HaGilui. So there's the Kael HaMizgala and there's Kael HaMistater. Like it says elsewhere. So really he's adding another point here. Besides the fact that it doesn't conceal because he sees everything, even though we may not see him, there's another point that the very concealment itself is part of who he is. That's his power. So why would that be a concealer? It's his power that he's using for whatever purpose because he wants to create existence. The existence doesn't recognize that on its own. But from the point of view of the Eibishter, it's completely part of Koyach Ein Sof. I know those that are processing can right away say that means the creation of the animal soul included. From God's point of view, it's just another creation of God's. I'm willing to say that, but we'll see it inside as we learn from the Mitler Rebbe. Okay. Just like the Koyach HaGilui, because again, the Gilui is not closer to God, to Atzmus, than Hester is. Remember, the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti is Gilui, and that's not closer to the Yesh Amiti than concealment is. And being that this concealment is also a power of Ein Sof, doesn't conceal anything at all from that point of view. We're going to use the example of the teacher and student, but I'll just say it here. When the teacher is teaching an idea, and he's also measuring what he's saying, and he's saying this much, he doesn't want to say more, and he even conceals some things, or does not fully express it, that's the same part of his teaching. It's just like we talk about the what's the word I want to use, the pace in music or in speaking. If you speak too quickly, it's not good. If you speak too slowly, it's not going to be understood. So even the pace, the very way we pace our words, meaning also the spaces between the sounds, or they say on a piece of paper, the white space between letters on the printed page is just as important, if not more important, than the black space of the letters themselves. So from the point of view of the teacher or the writer or the communicator, they're all part of his expression. From the point of view of the recipient, yes, one is a word and one is a pause between words. But why is the pause less important from the point of view of the speaker? They're both part of this expression. And it's just a question whether it's Koyach HaGilui or Koyach HaHester. Im came. And if so, so based on that, the ayin of the yesh, which is the source of the world, the lower level of ayin, which is a result of the tzimtzum and the parsa of concealment, who gam atzmus mamish, is unified with atzmus mamish, with the core source, just like the higher level of air that's encompassed in atzmus, that is not separated, so-called, applied itself to engage with existence, which is the ayin of the yesh amiti. All based on the fact that this Hester is not from the point of view from above, from Hashem, from the Atzmus. V'im came gam b'chinas ayin zeh, and therefore, this level of ayin, this lower level of ayin, v'kol mashen esava, and everything that was created, hakolu b'chinas ayin mamish, it's all in truth, ayin mamish b'chinas bitlu mitzias mamish. So even though before we called it bitla yesh, but from this perspective, it's bitlu mitzias mamish, because it's exactly the same level, nothing has changed. V'zeu shekosav, and there now he brings back the Mitler Rebbe's language. Ani rishon v'ani achron bilodai ein elakim. I am the first and I am the last, bilodai. And without me, there's no elakim, there's no other elakim. He's going to teach, what does it mean? Why are we coming to tell us there's no other God? That's obvious. It says, Ani Asius Ayin. We say Ani Rishon is the letter is Ayin. Ani Achron, the level is Ayin. V'yesh Beis b'chinas Ayin. The first Ani Rishon Ayin, Hainu Ayin Shal Yesh Amiti. That's Ani Rishon. I am the first, the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, the first level of Ayin. But Ayin Shal Yesh the Elamis is Ani Achron, the second level of Ayin. V'zeu Ani Rishon u'b'chinas Ayin de Keser. like we learned in the Mittler Rebbe, there's on a higher level is the ayin of Keser, Bechinas ha'ayin shel yesh amiti, which is the ayin of the yesh amiti that's higher than Keser. And that's why we say ukamhu. Remember, we learned that Keser is like dark before the cause of causes, before that ayesh amiti. V'ani achlen is referring to Bechinas malchus ha'ayin shel yesh denevroyim. The malchus, which is the ayin of the yesh of creation, of the creations. But Eimer, and we say ani rishon v'ani achlen, that kol shaveh, that kol bishaveh. What's the point of the verse saying not just I am the first? The same one that is first is last. I am both the first and the last, meaning equal. The other pasuk that the Rebbe, Mittler Rebbe brought, the Ru'u Ata Ki Anihu. So two levels are good. The Beit Pchinas Ani Shneim Shavim Lefonov Yizbarach. Ani is one with the Hu, both Ani. That call me Yuchid Atzmus Yizbarach. Everything is united with the core essence. And this is, if you want to know where it is in the Mittler Rebbe, this is on page we brought the two levels of Ani Rish, Ani Achlin, and Ani Anihu. I think it's on page 382, if I recall correctly. Yeah. Yeah, the top of the page, closer to the top of the page. And then he concludes, and then he goes the second half of the verse, and I think the Mittler Rebbe touched it this way also earlier. What is he coming to say? Elokim comes from the word Simsum. Elokim is din and helam. So he's saying Ein Elokim, not that there's no other God, because without him there's no Hester. He's the one that's causing the concealment. Ein Elokim amaster mafsiklal. There's nothing that covers or separates. So that's why I need Isha and Yachin, because there's no separation, because from his point of view, the Parsa is not doing any concealing. He himself is the concealer. Just as the first ayin is united with the core, so too the second ayin is united and completely nullified. It doesn't say miyuchid b'atzmusei. Is that a diuk to emphasize? I'm not sure, because he's clearly saying it's shava mamish. They're equal, but he does use a different expression, miyuchid b'atzmusei, miyuchid b'batel b'tachlis, because there he wants to emphasize it's not bitl ayesh, it's bitl mitzias. Okay, we're going to stop here. And the Rebbe Rashab will continue now to develop this further. As I said, all this is an elaboration of pages 381 through 384, top of 384 of the Mittler Rebbe. Okay, let me take any questions if anybody has anything. As I said, we've learned this now a few times. First of all, we learned it when we first learned Ayin Beis. Then we learned it in the Mittler Rebbe. Now we're learning it again in Ayin Beis. So hopefully learning it several times adds to the understanding of it. But if anybody has any questions, please. Okay, but so I'm going to stop here, bottom of page 1474, the end of the second paragraph, and we shall stop here. And as I said, there won't be a class now till next Sunday. Actually, I'm returning Friday morning.